Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being here today for the fourth instalment of Healthy Conversation, Always Caring for Country. Today's Healthy Conversation is being co-hosted by the Lowitja Institute and the Climate and Health Alliance. My name is Millie Burgess and I'm CAHA's Projects Manager. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming you and then passing over to our amazing panelists. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the lands we are all meeting on today. Here in Nipaluna, Hobart, I'm on Mawinina country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. At CAHA, we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work, and acknowledge that sovereignty of the land we call Australia has never been ceded. We commit to listening to and learning from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations about how we can better reflect Indigenous ways of being and knowing in our work. And today we are extremely privileged to have the opportunity to listen to and learn from two incredible Aboriginal women about the strength and leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in responding to climate change. And so on that note, I would like to welcome and introduce today's facilitator, Dr Summer May Finlay. Dr Summer May Finlay is a Yorta Yorta woman, senior lecturer at University of Wollongong with the School of Health and Society. She's the deputy chair of Australia's only community-controlled suicide postvention organisation, Thrilli. She's the co-chair of the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council of New South Wales Human Research Ethics Committee, Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health editor, and a contributing editor at Croaky Health Media. Thank you so much for being here today, Summer, and I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Millie. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Before I just actually do the housekeeping, I just also like to acknowledge the country that I'm on. I'm on Dharawal country of the Wadi Wadi people here in Wollongong. You're going to be hearing a lot about Wollongong over the next week because of the cycling. But for me, this is a beautiful place to live and to work and to raise my family. I'm eternally grateful for the elders that have looked after this country and the ancestors who have looked after it and those that continue to look after it. So really excited by today's conversation. Housekeeping, I'll get through this and then we can actually get to the meat of it. So please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear more about you. Make sure you mute your mics, particularly if you are leading lunch, because you will make me hungry. Videos, if you can, on. We'd love to see people's faces. It's always a much more connected way of speaking. Now, we are going to hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So please use the chat and put your questions in there. So if you hadn't already realised, this session is being recorded. And if you're live tweeting us, please do tweet. There's some hashtags there are some handles, that are really important for you to include. Got Croaky News, Climate _ that's a Healthy _ Climate, Lowitja Institute, and me, Summer May Finlay. So please do tweet. If we see you picking up your phones, we assume that's what you're doing, tweeting, and I look forward to be retweeting after the event. Don't forget also to include the hashtag, which is #ClimateHealth. Now, my favourite part is always introducing someone I have a huge amount of respect for. And I actually have the pleasure of introducing Janine last week. So for those of you that don't know, Dr Janine Mohamed is a proud Narrunga Kaurna woman from South Australia. Over the past 20 years, Janine has worked in nursing management, project management, research, workforce and health policy in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health sector. Honestly, she has done so much work for our communities. That small statement really doesn't capture the work she's done over the last 20 years. Many of these years have been spent in the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector at state, national and international levels. This includes the Aboriginal Health Council of South Australia, ACSA, the National Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organisation, NACCHO, and the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, CATSNM, where she was the CEO from 2013 to 2018. Janine has been based on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne since 2019 as the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. She was awarded an Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity Fellowship in 2019 and a Doctorate of Nursing honorary causa by Edith Cowan University in January 2020. In 2021, Janine was awarded a Distinguished Fellowship by the George Institute for Global Health Australia. She's a regular spokesperson on key topics in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, such as cultural safety, the social and cultural determinants of health, workforce and Indigenous data sovereignty. So over to you and me, Janine. We're just going to have a bit of a yarn today.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
So can we just start with understanding what caring for country means for you?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Summer. And of course, I would like to begin by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri peoples whose land I'm fortunate enough to live and work on. I extend that respect to all the beautiful lands, seas, waterways that everyone in the chat is, commenting that they're from. I pay my deepest respects and love to my elders, past and present, and of course extend that respect to future emerging generations, which we know this work in climate change and in health is so vital and important. And same, Summer, I'm so pleased to be with you here again within a week. I wish Bub was here with us. They'll probably spice up the conversation. And of course, I have to thank Kaha for their ongoing allyship, which of course includes their support to the Lowachi Institute. What does caring for country mean to me? Well, I think I have to start with what country means to me, and this is very personal to me. I'm only speaking on behalf of Janine Mohamed. I'm not speaking on behalf of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, but in a nutshell, country is where I was born, and it's of course the last place that I will go. It's traditional from my community that if you're from that community, that's where you go to be buried. So country is the bookends of my life. It's my constant. To me, country absolutely connects me to my genealogy. It places us, hey Summer, when we're talking to other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and how they're connected to me. So the first thing I'll say is, my name's Janine Mohamed, but I'm a Millera by birth, and I'm Narrunga Kaurna. And then, the conversation begins, and we begin to position each other around, around that identification. Of course, it defines my language group, my law, my obligations, whether that's, within my community or within my family. It's where, ceremony happens. And when I say ceremony, that's, things like sorry business, where funerals happen. That's where I go back to. It defines my role as well. And most importantly, it's a really special place for me where I go back to revitalisation and reconnection. So if anyone asks me, where's your special place, I know where that is straight away. And of course, country is very much central to me around celebrations and memories, as I'm sure many of you online have that as well. But I think being, raised Aboriginal, it raised me with the innate knowing that when country is not well, all that country provides for me can be potentially taken away. When country is unwell, of course, we lose things like sacred sites. And, that includes, of course, paintings and caves, but it's so much more than that. And it's very much tied in with our stories of creation and ceremony that I've already mentioned. When country's not well, it means a loss of food sources, so food security for us. And of course, that's, for people living in rural and remote, and, in some instances in urban areas, that restricts us from important nutrients that keep our physical bodies healthy and resilient against illness and disease. And I think you would have heard, if you've heard any of Narrunga people from South Australia talk, our lands and waterways are sacred and necessary for the survival of both our spiritual and physical being. And so Narrunga have often talked about the locking of the river and how that's brought disease to community and brought unwellness as well. Country is deeply important to our identities as individuals and as collectives, and cultural practices and knowledge systems. So what caring for country means for me is deeply embedded in our long history of caring for country and as our traditional custodians. And I underscore that word custodian. I suggest you look it up because it's very different to ownership, but as custodians of Mother Earth. And I should say that this also means that I understand my positionality in relation to country. I don't own it or have power over country. And I've always known that I'm a part of the ecosystem. So we are literally entwined with country. And you would have heard, if any of you have done any work in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, social justice, that, or even, in history, that we call the earth Mother Earth, and that is threaded throughout many Indigenous cultures around the globe. So Mother Earth, it sustains us and shapes our roles. And, when you think about a mum or a mother figure that you've grown up with, they shape you, and they skill you up. So Mother Earth, as it is, does shape our role. That old saying that we have, Summer, which is you only take what you need, from Mother Earth as well. It's a reciprocal relationship that we have with her. So we care for country, and country cares for us.
No, fantastic. And hearing you talk about what country means for you before caring for country, I think is really important for people to understand that we are country. I didn't grow up in my country, and my reconnections with country as a younger person, and then as an adult, and now as a mum, is really important. So thank you, Janine. So just thinking about climate change. We know the climate crisis, it's happening now. We see it out west, New South Wales. We're flooding, we've had fires, a whole bunch of things. How is the climate crisis impacting the ability of traditional custodians to access country, and what does that mean for health?
Yeah, well, that probably goes to the heart of a term and a lot of work that we've done at the Larrunga Institute on the social and cultural determinants of health. And I'll take it for granted that everyone online understands what the social determinants are, but the cultural determinants of health, we've done some work, and it's you can read about it. Jess has just put it in the chat. It's called Culture is Key. And I'll also talk about the Mirakawayu study done by Professor Ray Lovett in a moment. But look, if you go into those readings, it'll talk to you about the cultural determinants are really around our self-determination and our leadership, cultural expression and continuity. So you can see already, how that impacts. But look, I won't laundry list them all, Summer, because we've only got, 40 minutes here with each other today. But we know that the people who are going to be most affected by climate change are the most marginalised, and also have done, the least to cause climate change. And unfortunately, in Australia, that's us. And again, around the globe, that's most Indigenous peoples. So we're on the front line, of climate change and its impacts. In 2021, the Larrunga Institute worked in partnership with Kaha, and it was a great piece of work that we did to publish a discussion paper on climate change and our people's health. And I would trust that Jess pops that in as well. Look, the report gave us a number of recommendations, but I think what it really highlighted was exactly what COVID did, that it's compounding those historical injustices that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people already had in situ and remained undressed. And that climate change, as I've already said, is disrupting, cultural and spiritual connections to country that are central to our health and well-being. Yeah, look, an example of how it's impacting on traditional owners to access country, I think really comes from a story that was shared with us by Mr. Norman Frank Japarula. Now, he was is an elder, I should say, from Tennant Creek in Central Australia. And this has also been written about in their MJA Summer. So there's a whole peer-reviewed paper on this that he wrote with his local GP, amazing ally to our cause. But he describes how, extreme heat affects his health and well-being, and his community and his country. He told us that when he went off country for dialysis, he returned to find that the heat had affected his house so much that it had actually disconnected his power and spoilt his food, but his medicines were not able to be recovered as well because of the temperatures were so unsafe. So you can imagine, the health professionals online that, if this is insulin, that's spoiled, and that's a whole process that he has to go through to actually get those medications back, and it's actually life-threatening. He spoke how it's getting so hot that community can't practice ceremony anymore. And look, our report highlighted that our health services are also struggling to operate in this extreme weather. With increasing demands in this weather and a reduced workforce, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And I suppose at this point too, when we're talking about how climate change is affecting Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, often we're talking about us as a vulnerable population, Summer, but what I would love to hear is that strengths-based language, that actually we should be a priority population in these discussions. So yeah, climate change is also forcing migration, us to have to move off country, which is compounding again from those historical injustices, and causes irrevocable loss and damage to our people's health and well-being. It means that when we move off country, we're disconnected to our country, and there's a potential spiritual loss there, and a loss of connection to community, which has significant impacts. Your whole safety net is being disrupted. And what also needs to be understood, I think, is that this displacement, this migration that we have to do isn't new for us as a peoples. Colonisation of this country led to mass displacement of our people, whether that was, and that displacement of course was not something that it was forced upon us, whether that was under legislation where we had to be driven onto missions, or whether that was a product of demand for land because of wheat production and all the rest of it, that we were moved off of our traditional countries. So that trauma is ongoing and intergenerational, and of course is compounded by climate change and its impacts.
Absolutely. And can I just reiterate the use of the word vulnerable really bothers me personally. We aren't vulnerable. We are made vulnerable by the circumstances that we're often placed in. So I think priority populations is a really good choice of words as opposed to vulnerable. So you've talked about how climate change has impacted our communities, and I've had a reasonable amount to do with Nunjerry, and they talk about this a lot as well, particularly waterways. But how are our communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, leading prevention, mitigation and adaptation?
Yeah, so Aboriginal peoples, as I said, we're at the front line. We had the solutions. Our leadership in this space really does span across community responses based on localized knowledge of country, to national policy input, which we've had the pleasure of doing with CAHA and the Better Futures Forum. So yeah, our communities, they led the development of the 2020 best practice national guidelines to look after country, and the guidelines were based on our people's knowledges, and what that focused on really was strengthening and revitalisation of our knowledges, which includes our right to country as well. A really good example, I think, of this is that of the Arabana people. They're the traditional owners of, now I've got to get this right, Catathunda, which is Lake Eyre in South Australia, and they led a very bottom up or ground up participatory process that looked at the community's specific areas of local climate concern, I suppose. So that they were involved, community was involved throughout the whole process, and of course, when community is involved in the process right from the very start, that in itself is a protective factor for us. But the process, in looking at what was their priority for climate concern, the process itself readdressed the impacts of colonisation and dislocation that was caused by colonisation. It was a healing process to be able to do that, and the planning and the prioritisation really empowered the community to build capacity and capability that already existed there, as well as consider how to return to country. So, you know, that's just one example. I mean, Lowitja ourselves, you know, we're going through our own, I suppose, reflective practice about what is our footprint and how we can impact positively as an organisation, as well as our larger footprint. But, you know, those sorts of processes aren't funded at the moment. They're not embedded into accreditation standards. So I think that is probably something that we can look at into the future about how we can all sort of be on the same page and accountable to planning and processes going forward. And plus that CQI process of how we're travelling, are we actually achieving what we set out to achieve? So yeah, that's my answer for that one.
No, thank you. And so beyond actually looking at Lowitja's footprint, which is something that I think all individuals, but beyond us, organisations, companies, etc., need to be doing, is there anything else that Lowitja is doing around climate crisis?
Look, I think we're elevating Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people's voices into the sphere. You know, so it's not just it's our researchers. So there's a young Aboriginal woman that actually co-wrote our report, Amber Rose, who we're supporting to go off to the next COP. So growing up our own and elevating their voices into spaces that we've been invited into. And look, we're only invited into those spaces because of amazing organisations like CAHA. You know, that's why I say they're great allies, because they have already positions on many committees that they look around and they see that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people's voices aren't there. So they open the door for us into those spaces. I think our report as well, you know, when, forget her name, the Labor Minister, Susan, the Labor Minister just recently, you know, released her report on climate, and Lowitja Institute's report was referenced into that. So I think we're on the front foot and, you know, really gazing onto the horizon and knowing innately that climate was an issue for our people, even though the former government didn't think it was an issue. We knew it was an issue. So we began collating the voices and the recommendations so that when governments were ready to listen, that our voices were there ready to be heard. So I think that's just some of the ways. Look, and Lowitja Institute is an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health research institute. So we fund research only by Indigenous peoples, only to Indigenous organisations. And some of that work has been around climate change that we funded.
Yeah, fantastic. So really topical at the moment. We know that Prime Minister Albanese, and I still sometimes forget that it's Albanese, and I'm always pleasantly surprised when I remember that we do have a change of government. Talking about the voice to Parliament, it's one of the first things he said he was going to look at doing. So how would a voice to Parliament enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to better respond to the impacts of climate change?
It's a big question. And look, I've been very privileged to have been in probably what would be described as a front row seat to many of the discussions about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Summer, as you know, Auntie Pat Anderson, who was our long-term chair on the Lowitja Institute board and now the patron of the Lowitja Institute, along with Lowitja herself. Well, Auntie Pat was one of the architects of the Uluru Statement. And, you know, for those of you that don't know, she worked for many months, you know, across Australia, talking to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. But I'm sure, you know, and I hope that many of you would know it's a truly beautiful document. For me, it's a poem, it's a manifesto, a song, if you will, and it's a statement for change, to honour our ancestors, for our sovereignty and for our social justice. It's what we've been calling for a long time. So I urge you to all read it in full if you haven't yet. Auntie Pat beautifully describes it as a gift for all Australians, not to the government, not to the Parliament, but to all Australians. So its first call is for a voice to Parliament, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which we all get to vote on in the next 2 years at a referendum, and it's really, really critical to race relations in this country, that it's a yes outcome. And so these things are never won by individuals, they're won because of a people movement. And as I said recently at the Better Futures Forum, I hope you all get your questions answered and do your homework, and hopefully you'll vote yes, and we'll have an amazing celebration after that. But look, if we had a voice right now, it might give us an input into legislation, because that's what a voice would mean, that we had a place at the table when many discussions in Parliament would be happening. And when I say legislation, I don't think any more is more pertinent than to mention the recent climate change bill, which I don't think we had input. I don't believe we had input on that as a community. I think if we had a voice right now, it would be likely that we would have been, our voices would have been elevated, not on a side event at COP26. I think if we had a voice right now, we could have been leading the, it was called, look, it's the acronym is IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments. If we had a voice right now, our communities would be, included in that big national migration planning. These are crucial conversations, as I've already said, that impact significantly on our people. And I think, we must be included in emergency management and disaster risk planning. Look what happened with COVID, when we were able to have control and power for a very long time during COVID. We were something like 6 times, is that right, Summer? 6 times less likely to actually get COVID. So having a voice would ensure we have a say in how our country should be taken care of, given that I've just talked about, taking care of countries. And that would mean, like with COVID, governments need to stop managing us and instead work with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I love to call upon the work of Maori scholar Rhys Jones. Yeah, if you haven't heard Rhys talk yet, but please do so. He's done some really important work in this space. He talks about how relationships and truth telling are foundational to any discussions on climate change before that even begins. And he talks about how climate change is really a intensification on colonialism. And I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with him. So climate action for me is about truth telling and relationship building as well, and it requires a re-decolonisation process. So race relations must be rectified before we can actually act together and meet the challenges of climate change. And we've got a lot invested in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and its calls for voice, treaty and truth, and I think it will have an amazing impact on our voices being elevated into the climate change discussions.
Absolutely. I'm a big supporter of the Uluru Statement, its entirety, in particular a voice to Parliament. I think you're absolutely right. It will give us an opportunity to have input to things where we haven't before. And these decisions are being made whether we have a voice or not. So having that voice is really important. So the next kind of question is really for a lot of our allies or accomplices in the space. How can non-Indigenous Australians support the efforts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on climate action?
I love that word, accomplices. I think we were discussing it last week, weren't we, about what we could call allies. I tend to refer to them as my undercover brothers and sisters. But yes, look, a question like this really does deserve a webinar of its own. It would take me a good hour to talk about this subject because, as you know, Summer, I talk a lot about cultural safety and what it means to do cultural safety training, and that it's about self-reflection and doing that work on self and understanding our own biases and beliefs and where they come from, and challenging those before we can actually step into allyship. So suffice to say, this is, the work of allyship, but you know, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples know what collective action can do. I think hopefully many people online will know that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples weren't counted in the census and didn't get the vote until the 1967 referendum. And that came about not, yes, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people led the way, but it was non-Indigenous Australia that voted for that. So we know what the collective can do. And we know that we are 3% of the population. So we want the other 97% of the population to work with us, because they have often those high-level positions. You know, they have the power and the ability to elevate our voices, as we've already chatted about, Summer, and that includes the support for the Uluru Statement from the heart and that yes vote. You know, but as I've mentioned, that allyship, you know, requires people to engage in reflective practice about your role in rectifying race relations in the country, what you want your legacy to be in that space, understand and engage in decolonisation. You know, I often talk about dominant culture and what's normal in the world. And of course, for Australia, this is the basis of how we do things, what normal is. And that, of course, was brought here by non-Indigenous Australians when they arrived, and our ways of knowing, being and doing were displaced and discouraged. So I think the work of allyship is to really challenge dominant cultural worldviews and respect the knowledge and wisdom of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the lands, seas and waterways, and truly understand that communities have been caring for country for millennia. And I describe it as, you know, if you had a 6 metre long tape and, you know, each metre was 10,000 years, the actual time of colonisation, or the time that, you know, non-Indigenous people have been here, is actually two little fingers on that 6 metre tape. So that's, and of course we know we've been here for more than 60,000 years, but that just, you know, really does exemplify the long history that we have with this country. And to truly understand, coming to things like this and getting an understanding of that communities have been caring for the country for millennia and what it means to us. And I think don't just pay lip service to all this. Think about who you have on your communities and in your communities and in your campaigns. Are the voices central to your work, or are they central to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples? Have you measured it, you know, about the impact on us? And that when you do include us, that it's not just an add-on or a token, that it's truly a seat at the table that's respected. Yeah, and I think last but not least is to advocate for governments to hand back, you know, control of our land to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. Again, I think that's, you know, really important. And just over a week ago, the government, the Queensland government, gave back land to traditional owners of Cape York, and people's, you know, those peoples can now resume caring for their country. And I suppose I should quantify that when I say, you know, handing land back, it was always their land and it always will be.
Absolutely. You've just said so many things. I think I was nodding the whole way, and you've got a number of people in the chat that have been nodding the whole way as well. And just speaking of the chat, just pop your questions in the chat. We would love to actually hear from people in the audience about what they would like to know. And I absolutely agree with you, Janine. And it doesn't matter what space it actually is, whether it's on climate action or whether it's about health. Actually, if you are an ally or an accomplice, make sure that you are amplifying our voices, but not just actually speaking on our behalf, creating spaces where our mob, particularly those working on the ground, can actually speak about the needs of their communities. So, no, fantastic. So, this is kind of the last question I have for you, Janine, before we go over to the audience. So, do you have any thoughts on how we can embed climate change action into healthcare systems? Now, that's not a small question, so we're not ending on a small question there. Yeah.
Look, I think we've done a little bit of work. I've done a bit of work with a number of people over the years, and we've been really cognizant of, there's good people that are present and then they leave and everything that happens goes with them out the door. So I think we really do have to use the system against itself. That's legislation, that's accreditation standards, that's the education system, and really embed climate change mitigation into those systems. So we did a little bit of work. I've already mentioned the work of cultural safety for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives, and I used to be the CEO of CATSNAM. We really felt that we needed a culturally safe system, health system. So we went about teaching all the leaders that were in the nursing and midwifery, arena about cultural safety, and that created allyship and a shared understanding of what cultural safety was. And then that also made it easier because when we went into rooms where we wanted to embed cultural safety, we had allies already in there. But needless to say, and I think this is how we've affected the system somewhat, is that we ended up embedding cultural safety into education standards. We ended up embedding it into professional standards, into hospital accreditation standards, into university standards, and we're hoping to embed it into legislation as well so that we can actually begin to work with the system for all health professionals to really understand and most importantly, be accountable to cultural safety. I think that's the other bit, Summer, that we can embed things into systems, but then if we don't watch them and if we haven't got, sort of public displays of how people are tracking, we can really be left in the dark and people can say, yeah, we're doing fantastic, but that's the world according to them. So really having systems where you can think about where you embed climate mitigation and it not be left up to individuals, and then that reporting and accountability of that system back to us is really important as well, and that the people that are assessing the systems have a good understanding, because we found that the assessors of the accreditation system of the hospitals or the courses, if they didn't understand what cultural safety was, they were just ticking and flicking. So there's just a little bit of thinking about how we could possibly think of what the work that we did in cultural safety and how that actually can be applied to a systemic approach for climate change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking about when you were talking about cultural safety, Janine, about how much knowledge there is in our communities from those millennia that's often not respected because it's not built on Western-based science, and it's such a missed opportunity when we're actually in a crisis and we have needed this knowledge. So I think, just having to think through that. We've had a number of questions from people in the audience. I'm going to, there's two that are a little bit similar, so I'm just going to actually combine them. The person's asked, I know it's a little bit of a way off, but they're keen to understand thoughts on how they can best support the Voice to Parliament campaigns.
Yeah, I think probably first and foremost is to find your own voice. So, there's plenty of amazing websites out there that have been produced that really unpack what the Uluru Statement from the Heart means and how it came about. I think it's, and then it's those conversations, those water cooler moments. It's wearing the t-shirts that are often the conversation starters, and being comfortable in also saying that you don't know everything. And that, but I know for me, I don't know everything there is, and what I'm really happy to say to people, I just know it's the right thing to do. When I can't answer every question. And I think it's also, just waiting for those moments of people, what does it mean for you? And being able to share that and having that in your, in your back pocket around that. So I think in your workplace as well, there's often reconciliation action plans. This is a part of reconciliation. So encouraging people to have workplace conversations, whatever sphere you're really operating in, and where you can find leverage to be able to have dialogue. And of course, on those websites as well, people have created amazing resources that you can show in your workplace. And in some instances, there's allyship and people on the ground that are happy to come and talk. about what that means, the Uluru Statement from the heart means to them.
Yeah,
I think the first part is reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also listening to, there's a video on YouTube where Megan Davis actually reads it in front of the audience that helped create the Uluru Statement. So listening also to her speak it is, I found, really powerful. But I absolutely agree with you, Janine. The first thing you need to do is actually read it and understand it. And the second, which is what you've indicated, is really just getting out there and promoting it. I'm a big believer, if you believe in something and it is such a significant piece of work, we need to be proactive. We can't actually wait for people to come to us or give us permission. And for non-Aboriginal people out there, I highly encourage you to also, at times there's been some myths, or there's some people that have like understanding around the Uluru Statement, and it's a perfect opportunity, if you are familiar with it, to kind of correct some of those misunderstandings. So yeah. Fantastic.
And I think probably, those notions of all Aboriginal people should be agreeing on this as well and should be on the same page. So I think that's one expectation that's put onto us as a group of people. And that's why at one point, Summer, I said, I'm only talking about what country means for Janine Mohamed, because I don't want anyone to go offline and think that it's actually about what it means for all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. Because of course, if you look at Tyndale's map of Australia, it shows all the beautiful, diversity that is Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australia. And of course, same for non-Indigenous Australia. You guys don't agree on everything. Look at our parliament. So Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples aren't going to agree on everything too. So, when people go, but, they don't even know what they want. Well, I think the majority of voices do say this is what we want. But of course, like all social groups, you will always have differing opinions on that.
Absolutely. And I actually think it's really important that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the space to be able to have those conversations, to share our difference of opinion and not feel like it is going to be used against us or as a divisive tool. I've got a number of questions now coming in, which is fantastic. So we've had a person here who's been over in Pakistan, which they've, as you're all probably aware, about a third of the country is underwater. It's I can't even imagine actually what that must be like for people over there. So this is kind of a multi-part question. So I'm going to start with the first half and then I'll ask you the second, because then neither of them are small questions. How can Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices be elevated to connected to movements in the global south for climate reparations? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a value statement, isn't it? How can we be elevated? It's about valuing and thinking that our voices are needed and required into these spaces. But I think what we've got against us, and look, I've worked at the United Nations, so, we've gone away, Summer, for the UN DRIP, and we've also been a part of the Indigenous Peoples Permanent Forum. And when you go to these places, we say, look, we have third world conditions. We die, 11 years younger than the rest of other Australians. But we're in a first world country, and what we're competing against are people in third world countries having third world conditions. We're in a first world country with third world conditions, but we're 3% of the population. So, those sort of discussions and positionalities need to be thought about and unpacked. So for Indigenous Australians, I think, in those discussions when we go to forums and whatnot, we're such a small, population, but we have such a long enduring history and connection to our country, and we've got a lot to share. So, and the voices that we're asking to elevate our voices to are usually, non-Indigenous people. So it's a big conversation, it's a big ask, and it's the only way that we're going to bridge that is by doing things like this and having dialogue. And I'm not quite sure if I've answered that question, but I think you have to understand the structures and that we're working within to be able to understand why we aren't there already and what we need to do to actually be there. And as I said, Rhys Jones says it all when he says that it's actually a value statement. It's about relationships and race relations first and foremost, and how we're viewed globally.
So just kind of expanding on that, and I think you answered the question, but the second part of this question was in relation to the connectedness. So assuming we do connect, what would be some of the forms of direct action required to build that solidarity and take the discussions on climate emergency outside of its silos?
So I think, you know, we've done it before, Summer, where there's actually been a designated seat for Australia to have, you know, us as a nation state having an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander seat. So I think that's one way that we could actually, you know, through action, lobby and ensure that we have a seat at the table. Can you just repeat the question a little bit for me? And my earphones keep popping out of my ear. They don't quite fit in my ear. I shared with the team before we went on, I feel like I'm doing that thing that you're never meant to do on TV, which is play with your earpieces.
No, fair enough. What would be some of the forms of direct action required to build that solidarity, so between the Global South and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and take the discussion on climate emergency outside of its silos?
Oh, look, outside of its silos means a big think about those silos and who they actually, and who they, how they were created. And they're usually not created by, for, or with Indigenous peoples. It's almost like taking those silos and going, well, you know, where were our voices? Again, I think about the Australian Constitution. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, nor were women involved in our Constitution. Hence we don't, you know, it doesn't serve us as populations. So I think, the who those silos serve need to be thought about. And I think Indigenous peoples have a really unique perspective on how that actually, they need to be rethought or reimagined into the future, those silos. And I think, how do we do it? And the first and foremost, look, it's probably, you know, it is always starts with a conversation with people. How I've always bridged the gap in the past is really shared with people, you know, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people's unique positionality and our unique history in Australia. I was with a group of people just last week of prominent sports people, and I said to them, okay, how many of you know about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history? How many of you were taught it in schools? And none of them put their hands up. And these are people all in their 20s and early 30s. So I think there's a lot of education gap filling that needs to happen, and people have to go away and do that work before we can truly have you know, good conversations where we're on the same page about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australia. So I think that's the starting point, the conversations and that acknowledgement that there is a gap in our education and what we understand about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australia.
Thank you. Thank you. I just got a tickle.
That's all right. Yeah, you go. Cough. I think the other little point that I would make, it's probably just to drive home when systems are created, who was included, who was locked out, what was swept under the rug. Those sorts of conversations then lead to, well, who was included in decision making and who was excluded, therefore who benefits from systems and who doesn't.
I think my voice is back.
That's okay.
Sorry. Thanks, Janine. That's great. I don't know what happened. Sorry, it's got a tickle. We've got a couple of other questions here. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of them, but we will try. But keep them coming. We've got one here. Could you please expand, Janine, on how cultural and environmental safety in healthcare might be strengthened by standards and accountability mechanisms?
Yeah, so how it might be strengthened. Well, I don't know if environmental standards are included at the moment, but what I can tell you is that when cultural safety standards were included, that meant people had to be accountable and had to show evidence against the standards that were put into place. So, for example, they had to show what their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce was and what they were planning for into the future. They had to show that they had in-services on cultural safety. Their staff needed to be able to display that they knew what cultural safety was. And that's just a few of the things that they had to demonstrate because of this standard. But there were whole guidelines that were created by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that sort of walked, organisations through what were some of the activities they could do to prove that they had met that standard. So I think similarly, and this requires thinking again with Indigenous people at the table, what would be some of the environmental or climate change standards that we could create that health services would need to respond to. But I think, not to put the whole onus onto health services as well, because, with all of this needs to come funding from governments to actually ensure that our health services have resources in place to be able to meet the standard. So I think it's probably a national conversation that we'd have to have. And then you look, the public stuff, it really is about, if you don't meet the standard, then you get funding taken away from you. And also that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know, look, they're not serious about cultural safety. They're not serious about providing us with the best possible care as a health service. So I think that also says something to the community as well about the service that they are potentially attending and making choices around that.
Fantastic, thank you.
Does that help? Yeah.
Use the chat function if but I think some of this, these are really big questions, Janine, and I think you indicated earlier that one question in particular you could speak for an hour or more on. So these are definitely ongoing conversations as opposed to just this particular session. Just a question here about mental health. So this person's just said, considering how easily climate change awareness can trigger the overwhelming response so easily in people, and there's been obviously a long history of environmental degradation since colonisation, they really want to understand how actually engaging in climate action can be good for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's mental health.
Okay, well, I suppose it's thank you for the comment. I think this probably really is the work of Ray Lover and his Merikawaiu study, where he looked at Indigenous rangers and their health and wellbeing, and how their health and wellbeing, so when I say wellbeing, that includes mental health, was vastly improved compared to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that weren't working with or on country. There was a 2011 modelling that happened, and it indicated that the potential net annual savings was around $270,000 a year in chronic disease and primary healthcare costs. So this is savings for remote communities that were participating, in land management. So like you've already said, the impact of climate change absolutely threaten these positive benefits. So I think you absolutely have to understand the benefits of being on country, working on country, caring for country, returning to country, having country in place. You have to understand those benefits to understand, the impact as an individual, as well as a community. But there's plenty of evidence out there now that links, health to health outcomes and activities that take place on country for beneficial health outcomes. They show an amazing relationship to country and health. They've shown improved indicators for diabetes, hypertension, renal disease, and as you've mentioned, psychological distress or mental health, and having a high life satisfaction and a high scale rating of family and individual well-being when you're connected to community, and community meaning country, and also country meaning your identification. So I hope people got that today, that when I was talking identity of knowing who you are, and therefore knowing who your country is extremely important to notions of belonging, identity and self, and therefore good health. Does that help?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you made that point again, because yeah, it's really important that we know who we are. And it's like when I say I'm a Yorta Yorta woman, people are me, oh, so you're related to blah, blah, like they can place you, they know you, the connections are already established and identified. Look, I'm going to ask you one.
I think it's also, I was just going to add on to that too, Summer. I think it's really important for the audience to know that you're often challenged about who you are as an Aboriginal person, and who your people are. And let's be frank, that's through racial bias. So, oh, you're not really an Aboriginal, you must be only a half caste, or, you know, those sorts of comments get made, or Aboriginal people get lots given to them. And as I said last week in a workshop, I'm still waiting for my free house and my free car.
Me too.
So, you know, these sorts of things are said to us, and the hypervigilance that happens, because they are often said, are really counteracted, and culture and connection are a buffer to that, because if you know who you are and you're connected to your culture and your community, that's just like, you can't tell me. I know who I am and where I'm from and who my culture is. So I think country and identity are in itself, my earphones just falling out are really, you know, yeah, as I've already said, a protective factor against the slurs of racism to our identity.
Absolutely. We're pretty much going to finish up. Have you got any final words that you'd like to share with our wonderful audience?
Well, I just thank you so much for taking the time out today to come along and to listen to Summer and I yarn. Look, I don't have a background in climate change. I'm a health professional by trade, but I've been Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander my whole life, or Aboriginal my whole life. So I hope that I've, you know, shared with you a little bit about our culture and Lowitja Institute, the work that we're doing, and how you can all help in the coming years. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Janine. And I'm going to hand back to Millie from Kaha.
Thanks so much, Summer, and thank you so much, Janine. I'd like to say a huge thank you to you both on behalf of everyone here today for generously sharing your insight, your stories and your wisdom with us all. And I feel really grateful and privileged to have been present for this really important discussion, and I hope it's one that we can all continue together. I'd also like to say a huge thanks to the team at Lowitja for helping to organise this event today. They've put in lots of hard work, so thank you so much to Jess and Rosemary. And finally, I'd like to say a thank you to everyone in the audience for your participation and engagement in this discussion. We'll be sending around a follow-up email after the event with the recording from today and the links to all of the resources discussed during the session. So that includes all of the resources from the Lowitja Institute that Janine mentioned, and the others as well. And I'd like to also just mention that the Climate and Health Alliance is looking to illuminate and celebrate examples of health services integrating caring for country in how they deliver healthcare in our upcoming Greening the Healthcare Sector Forum. So if you'd like more information about the showcase, please get in touch with us at gghh@kaha.org.au. And thanks again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.